Yeah, so as you probably know by now, as you're probably sick of hearing us say, over the last year we've been doing a series on Buddhism through time and space. So we've been looking at how the Dharma has manifested itself in all sorts of different ages and different societies, and exploring what that tells us about how we can practice here and now. And over the past few weeks we've been looking at Buddhism here and now. In particular, we've been looking at what we might call Triratna Buddhism. We've been looking at, in particular, the emphases and the attitudes that we need to practice the Dharma here and now, that are different perhaps from those needed by an Iron Age farmer from the Indus Valley, for example, or a Tibetan medieval peasant, or a member of the Japanese warrior class in 11th century Japan, something like that. So we've got particular strengths and weaknesses, etc. Incidentally, can you hear me? Because our really high-tech radio mic isn't working, so I'm relying on that. And if I move around, sometimes it doesn't work. So if you can't hear me, could you just put your hand up? Let me know. Yeah, so we've called this mini-series what we need to know in order to grow. So, because we've got very different needs from some of the people who practice the Dharma in traditional Buddhist societies. We've got different strengths, we've got different weaknesses, we've got different advantages, we've got different disadvantages. We come from a very different culture, which means we think differently, we sort of model the world differently. We've got different spiritual and artistic tradition, which means there are different things that inspire us and move us. We've got different myths. So this mini-series, as I say, is about what we need to take on board to practice the Dharma effectively, that perhaps wouldn't have been necessary to emphasise to, as I say, an Iron Age inhabitant of the Indus Valley, for example. And I think it's really important to take account of these differences that I've talked about between ourselves and people in traditional Buddhist cultures. It's really important to take those differences on, because in some parts of the modern Western world, or sometimes in the modern Western world, a sort of false Dharma has grown up. Mainly because people haven't taken account of those differences. And that's meant that they've distorted the Dharma in ways that we aren't even aware of, because we've distorted it in ways that almost we take for granted, certain ways of thinking. So one of the ways this manifests is that sometimes people try to practice the Dharma in a sort of solitary, individualistic way. So we live in a really individualistic culture, where all the emphasis is on me, my opinions, my wants. And in this atmosphere we get very isolated from others. We retreat into a shell that we call privacy. And this has strongly influenced how Buddhism has sometimes manifested in our culture. We've got a tendency to make it a private affair. So in this individualistic near enemy of the Dharma, Buddhist practice becomes all about meditation, because meditation is something you do in private. It's all about me and my mental states, my insight. It all happens in the privacy of my own mind. We don't have to interact face to face with others. Maybe others more experienced than ourselves. Or maybe we just do it in a virtual way, in the virtual world, where we don't have to sit face to face with people. And practicing like this, we can think we're getting really advanced. We can use the Dharma to bolster our ego, and we don't have to open up to the challenge of other people. We don't have to listen to other people who see us maybe more clearly than we see ourselves. We don't have to submit ourselves to the reality check that other people give us. So in this near enemy of the Dharma, we can practice, but we don't really have to change. We can live the life we've always lived and practice Buddhism as a sort of hobby. In the same way that we might practice physical yoga or go to the gym or take up macrame or something. And of course we can tell ourselves that this isn't just all about me. Of course it's not just all about me, because I'm quite a lot nicer to the checkout person at Waitrose than I used to be. Or I'm really nice to the mechanic who services my Merc. So, you know, I'm making the world a better place. I'm making the world a better place. Well, okay, actually there's nothing wrong with this. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. Being a little bit nicer and a little bit more positive in our mental states, a little bit more able to enjoy our comfortable life while it lasts. There's nothing wrong with that. The only trouble is, it's not Buddhism. It might be what has been called Buddhism light. Buddhism light for the West. But it certainly isn't Buddhism in its fullness. It isn't Buddhism in its rich, radical, exhilarating, inspiring, life-changing reality. It isn't that. So the title of tonight's talk, the thing that we need to know in order to grow, that I'm going to talk about tonight, is that Buddhism is not just a hobby. It's not just a hobby. It can't just be a hobby. If it's just a hobby, it isn't Dharma, it isn't Buddhism. So I suppose the definition of a hobby might be something that we do as an added extra, something that we tack onto our life that leaves the rest of our life unchanged. A hobby sort of exists in a sealed-off compartment, separate from the really important things in our life, like our career and how much money we're making and whether we've got a good pension and so on. A hobby is an extra that doesn't change the rest of our life. But we can't practice Buddhism as a hobby, or if we do, it isn't Buddhism. We can't come to the Buddhist Centre once or twice a week, maybe even meditate every morning, maybe even read the odd Dharma book, and treat that as something separate from the rest of our life. If our practice of the Dharma stays in a compartment, if it doesn't change the rest of our life, we aren't practicing the Dharma. Because what Buddhism is really about is a reorientation of our life. It's about a change in the way we view the world that leads us to change where we are looking for happiness and fulfillment. Leads to a change in what we look to give meaning to our life. A change in our priorities, a change in what we think is important. If it's working, the Dharma leads to a change in what we think our life is all about. And that's got to mean that we change the way we live. So traditionally, this reorientation, this reorganisation and reorientation of our life, this change in what our life is about, is referred to as a change in what we go for refuge to. So you'll hear this Buddhist code, going for refuge, going for refuge. So it is a sort of a Buddhist code. And if we haven't come across this language before, we need to unpack it. Some people, it can sound very off-putting. It sounds a bit cowardly. Oh, going for refuge. But the idea here is that we all go for refuge to something or some things. We all look for meaning in life from something. We all look to something as our source of happiness and fulfillment. We all look to something as a sort of refuge amidst the uncertainty and impermanence and unsatisfactoriness of the world. We all do that. So some people go for refuge to wealth, financial security. That's a really top priority for a lot of people in our society. Livelihood and security is all important. Some people go for refuge to career. And that, of course, can get mixed up with going for refuge to financial security and money. Some people go for refuge to possessions. In our society, especially having a really nice house and maybe a nice car can almost become what life is all about. Look at the number of TV shows there are about how you can have a really nice house. I think they might outnumber the TV shows about how you can have really nice mental states by about an infinite number to zero or something. Infinitely, whatever it is that we can tell us. What happens when you divide something by zero? So making our houses look nice, a major concern for a lot of people. Some people go for refuge to family. Some people go for refuge to pleasure. Having a good time in all the possible forms it can take. Nights out, meals out, holidays, alcohol, drugs, sex. All the different forms of pleasure that you can imagine. You can probably imagine some that I can't even imagine. And I can probably imagine some that I'm not going to tell you about. Even biscuits, sweeties and junk food. Biscuits, sweeties and junk food can be a refuge from the unsatisfactoriness and uncertainty of life. Some people go for refuge to entertainment and distractions. Movies, DVDs, TV, internet, anything to take our mind off that slightly uncomfortable reality. People look to all these different sort of things as a source of their meaning and happiness in life, their fulfillment. So if the person who goes for refuge to the house suddenly has to live in a little rented flat in Walkley, it feels like their life has fallen apart. The meaning's gone. It's terrible. If somebody who goes for refuge to career suddenly finds himself under redundant and under scrap heap, the meaning in their life has gone. It's as though their life has fallen apart. And so on. So a good guide to what we go for refuge to is what are the things, if we lost them or couldn't do them anymore, would make us feel as though our life had fallen apart. And some of these refuges, some of the things we go for refuge to are better than others, okay? Some lead to relatively skillful behaviour and a certain amount of growth. Some lead in the opposite direction, to greed for money, to addictive tendencies, to ill will and competitiveness. But the trouble with all these refuges, whether they be the better end of the refuges or the worse end of the refuges, maybe family might be towards the better end and drugs towards the worse end, whichever end it is, the trouble with all these refuges is that in the end they don't work. In the end they're unreliable. For one thing, they're all temporary. So the person who goes for refuge to career eventually has to retire. And then the meaning in their life has gone. The person who goes for refuge to family, eventually the family leave home and you see them at Christmas. The pleasure seeker eventually gets older. Nights out and drinking and drugs don't work so well anymore. The sex isn't so available. And they become a bit of a pitiful figure, the oldest swinger in town. These refuges are temporary and they are uncertain. But even more than that, these refuges can't really provide us with the meaning that will give us fulfillment, that will really satisfy us. Because we human beings are spiritual beings. We're spiritual beings. And if our life doesn't have that spiritual element, if it isn't fulfilling that spiritual element, we will feel hollow and unsatisfied somewhere in the back of it all, even if everything that we think of as giving meaning to our life is going quite well. It'll all feel a bit hollow eventually. So, false refuges. We all go for refuge to something. That's what I've sort of done a bit of a list of what most of us go for refuge to. Some people might be able to come up with other things. But traditionally, what makes someone a Buddhist is that they have shifted away from going for refuge to things like money or possessions or status or family or sensory pleasures, and instead they go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. What makes someone a Buddhist is that they have made that shift, that they have gone for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. That is what a Buddhist is. A Buddhist is someone who does that, for whom those things are of central importance in their life. So this is a language. This is a language that goes back to the earliest records of the Buddha's life. Over and over again in the Pali Canon, we would see the Buddha opening people's eyes. He would talk to people and he would open their eyes to a completely different way of seeing life. A completely different way of seeing what life was all about. And over again, these people would say something like, it's amazing, it's as though what was upside down has been turned the right way up. It's as though a lamp has been brought into a dark room. I see things completely differently. I go for refuge to the Lord, to the Buddha, to his Dharma, and to the Sangha. Over and over again, that happens. To the spiritual community. And of course, these people would live different lives. They would live different lives from then on. For them, it was certainly not a hobby. Having gone for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, it was not a hobby. It had changed their life. They'd been shown a different way of seeing life, and this had completely changed what they thought life was about. Some dropped everything. Right, that's it. They dropped everything and they became homeless wanderers, completely, full-timely dedicating themselves to the spiritual life. But many were householders with responsibilities and families, and they, on the whole, carried on with their farms and their businesses and their families. But they no longer saw those things as the central meaning of their lives. Life was a spiritual affair. Life had become a spiritual affair. And that completely changed how they lived, what they did with their time, what they did with their energy, what they did with their money, the choices they made, even if the outward structures of farm, business and family remained the same. They were living a different life. So last week, Vajratara talked about how we need to change the myth we live by. She talked about how we need to change the myth we live by. How we need to change the story that we tell. The story that gives our life meaning, the story that puts meaning into our life. So she suggested that one way of looking at this was we needed to change our myth from the myth of Genesis, the myth that we have been created in God's image and we have been given the world, given lordship over the world to satisfy our wants. That's what Genesis, I can't remember the exact words, but that's basically what Genesis says. That the world is there for us to use to satisfy our wants. So she said we need to change our myth from this, that the world exists to satisfy our wants, to the myth of the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. That's what she suggested. I haven't got time to really go into that, but basically it means to come together with others to create something much bigger than the individual, to manifest enlightenment in the world. We can think of other ways. We can think of other ways in which we could articulate this changing of the story that we tell about life, that gives life meaning. But however we express it, that is basically what going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha means. We change the stories that we live by from being about money or possessions or pleasure and so on, to being about spiritual concerns. That's what it means. That's what going for refuge means. So traditionally this is put in terms of going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. That's the language that's used. And okay, well, what might that mean? What might that mean exactly? Maybe we need to unpack that a bit too, because the Buddha was a man who's been dead for 2,500 years. How on earth can we go for refuge to the Buddha? But what we actually go for refuge to when we go for refuge to the Buddha isn't the historical man, it's the principle of Buddhahood. It's the principle that we all have tremendous potential, that we can all change and grow towards enlightenment, that we can all become magnificent, beautiful, noble beings as the Buddha was. We can all move in that direction. So growing towards enlightenment ourselves, helping others to grow towards enlightenment, that becomes the central meaning of our life when we go for refuge to the Buddha. That becomes the central meaning of our lives, more important than our house or our bank balance, or whether we get the pleasures we're used to. It doesn't mean we can't have those things, but they're no longer central. That is central. So we go for refuge to the Buddha. When we go for refuge to the Dharma, we commit ourselves to the teachings and practices that can bring that about, that can move us and others towards the being that they could be. So we commit ourselves to practicing the Dharma, and we commit ourselves to making the Dharma available in the world. Ultimately, we commit ourselves to living according to the truth of the way things are. So we go for refuge to the Buddha and the Dharma. And then we go for refuge to the Sangha. Maybe that's got several different aspects. Firstly, we commit ourselves to the Sangha of beings who have broken through to a new way of seeing the world, the Arya Sangha, the noble Sangha of the great beings. We also commit ourselves to the actual Sangha as it manifests in our life. Actual people who practice the Dharma. We need to do that both as a means, if you like, and as an end. So we commit to being part of the Sangha because we need the support and guidance and inspiration and friendship of other people if we are going to get anywhere. So we commit ourselves to being part of the Sangha, bringing the Sangha into existence. But we also commit ourselves to creating the Sangha as a goal in itself, actually. As a goal in itself. Part of what our life is about becomes helping to create a completely different new sort of community in the world, bringing about a completely different way that human beings are together, come together. A community in which enlightenment can be manifest more and more in the world. A community in which the barriers between people are broken down. In which we keep our individual uniqueness, but at the same time to come together in a very, very strong sense of community. As there's a passage in the Pali Canon where some of the Buddha's followers say, we are many in body, but we are one in mind. And that is a goal in itself, to bring about Sangha at that level. That's what enlightenment means, to bring about enlightenment, to bring about Sangha at that level. And that's what the myth of the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara that Vajratara talked about is really getting at. That's what it really means. So, that's going for refuge, a little bit about going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. That's what makes us Buddhist. And that's not a hobby. And maybe because many people in the Western world want to see Buddhism as a sort of hobby. Added on to an otherwise worldly life. Sangha, the founder of our order, has put a lot of emphasis on going for refuge as the most important aspect of the Buddhist life. It's what is really important. So for Sangha and for us in Triratna, going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha is the central act. He calls it the central act of the spiritual life. The central attainment, if you like. If you want to talk about attainment, going for refuge at a deeper and deeper level is the attainment that we're after. It's the most important aspect of the spiritual life. It's what it's all about. It's all about this shift in what we see life is about and the effect that has on how we live. What our goals are, where we put our energies and resources. And so Sangha actually talks about that as bringing together all the different aspects of the spiritual life. So he talks about If you look around the Buddhist world, you can find schools of Buddhism that put tremendous emphasis on insight. Seeing the nature of things, seeing impermanence, seeing unsatisfactoriness. You can see Buddhist schools that put tremendous emphasis on Shraddha, on, if you like, that intuitive sense of direction that sometimes gets called faith, that sort of call to connection with the higher, particularly, say, in the Pure Land schools of Japan and so on. You get schools of Buddhism that put tremendous emphasis on altruism, on acting for the benefit of the world. The Bodhisattva ideal, many schools of Mahayana really emphasize that. You get schools of Buddhism that put tremendous emphasis on renunciation, on just living a simpler life, doing without the usual worldly stuff. But what Sangha says is actually these are all different aspects of going for refuge. They all feed into going for refuge, and going for refuge will feed out to all of them. We can approach it in different ways, but in a way we need to approach it in a sort of whole way. They're all aspects of that central shift. It's a central turning about in who we are, which has elements of clearer seeing, it has elements of longing for something better, seeing something better as possible, it has elements of going beyond the self, and altruism has elements of wishing to simplify, wishing to live a simpler, more elegant life without so much stuff and clutter. And this central spiritual act, going for refuge, he says, can happen at different levels. So he says, well, you know, there are people who go for refuge at what he calls the ethnic level. So people who are born in Buddhist countries, maybe they don't change their life very much, but actually they think of themselves as Buddhists. That has a slight effect on the way they live. It's ethnic. Of course, about provisional. You know, maybe we go on a retreat and it's, yes, wonderful. And we think, yes, I really want to do this. I've really got to change. And then Tuesday we've forgotten about it. That's provisional. He talks about then that moving on to effective going for refuge. Effective going for refuge is where it becomes a constant enough stream in our life that it really keeps us moving forward. As long as we're sort of in reasonably favourable circumstances, we will keep going, we're in it for the long haul. And Sangha says, well, that's what we need as order members. The order members need to be at that level to become an order member. But then he talks about that leading on to real going for refuge, which is what order members, for example, should be aiming for. And in real going for refuge, it's become irreversible. There's been such a shift that we can never go back. We can never go back. We might sort of waver a bit, but we'll never go back. There's been such a shift in our being that we're irreversibly destined to just keep going on. And that's the goal in a way, because once we've got there, we've done it in a way. And then he talks about cosmic going for refuge, and I'm not going to say anything about that. You can imagine that. So he talks about going for refuge, this commitment, this change, this willing a different life as the central thing. I mean, I think that's really important because our volitions are so important. We are creatures of desire, of volition, and this is about what we're going for, what we're trying to bring into existence. And that's really central to us. It's what we are. So going for refuge is a change in what we are, and it changes our life. Going for refuge. Sangha is saying that is the central act of the spiritual life. It brings in all the other things. It's what we should really focus on. So I talked about false refuges and Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. I'm just going to briefly have a little bit of a diversion into a different way of talking about going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And that is to look at a sort of Buddhist list, if you like, which is called the 8 worldly winds. Because the 8 worldly winds sort of sum up the story we usually tell. Yeah? The story we usually tell about what makes a good life. So the 8 worldly winds consist of 4 pairs. We've got gain and loss, approval and disapproval, praise and and blame, approval and disapproval. We've got pleasure, pain, discomfort, and we've got status, fame and loss of status. So 4 pairs. And the story we usually tell is that life is good when we are gaining and not losing, gaining possessions, gaining money, gaining whatever, and not losing. When people approve of us, and when we avoid blame and disapproval. When we're getting pleasure, and avoiding discomfort, or even pain. And when people look up to us and we're sort of rising in the pecking order, we've got status. Not when we're losing status and everybody thinks we're not worth bothering with. So that sums up an awful lot of the way what we go for refuge to in a worldly sort of life. And in a way, going for refuge to Buddha and Dharma and Sangha, going for refuge to becoming a Buddhist involves a shift, where instead of thinking, what's going to bring me gain and avoid loss? What's going to get me approval and avoid disapproval? What's going to get me pleasure and avoid pain? What's going to get me status and avoid loss of status? We think, what's skillful? What's skillful? How can I act as skillful? We act skillfully and knowing that will sometimes bring gain and sometimes bring loss. We act skillful. We act in skillfully ways, knowing that it will sometimes bring approval and it will sometimes bring disapproval. But that doesn't matter, because that's not what we're going for refuge to. We act skillfully, knowing that will sometimes bring pleasure and sometimes it will bring pain. But that's not what matters, because that's not what we're going for refuge to. And we act skillfully despite knowing that it will sometimes bring us status. People will think we're wonderful. And sometimes it will bring us lack of status and people will think we're a bot. But that's not what matters. So, in a way, none of the worldly winds matter, but what matters is acting skillfully. Acting so as to be more like an enlightened being, acting in accord with the Dharma, and acting to benefit the Sangha. Going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And the rest doesn't matter. So that, in a way, sums up, very briefly, that's a simple way of thinking about what going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha might mean. So just a bit of a recap. What makes someone a Buddhist is going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. Going for refuge to our spiritual potential and that of others, the means that we can actually make that manifest, and the spiritual community, bringing about a new way of being with others in the world. And this going for refuge to Buddha, Dharma and Sangha means a shift in the myth we live by. It means a shift in the story we tell that gives meaning to our life. From normal worldly concerns that are generally all about ourselves and those we're close to spiritual concerns that are bigger than the individual. What that means, because that's what Buddhism, being a Buddhist, means, that means that we cannot do Buddhism as a hobby. The aim of Buddhism is not just to help us have a more comfortable life in samsara. So I'm going to tell a bit of a story. We talked about myths. Vajratara talked about myths and stories we live by. So I'm going to tell a story that maybe illustrates this point, that Buddhism doesn't aim to just help us have a more comfortable life in samsara. Okay? So this is a myth, if you like, that's sort of cobbled together, if you like, from a number of related myths, a whole family of myths, in many different spiritual traditions, that all point to the same spiritual reality. And this is what Sangha calls the myth of the return journey. So I'm going to tell us a version of this myth, as I said, cobbled together from different stories, but sort of representing the essence, if you like, of what this whole family of myths is about. So once upon a time, there was this truly remarkable kingdom. It's the sort of place you come across in fairy tales with sort of towers and banners. It was an incredibly beautiful place. A wonderful place inhabited by higher beings. Noble people, spiritually mature people. This was a place where people behaved beautifully towards each other. A place of deep friendships, deep sense of solidarity and community among the inhabitants. A place of noble and comely behaviour. And physically it was also a place of great beauty. People lived quite simple lives, but there was no ugly overconsumption or silly consumer toys. Instead, the wealth of the kingdom was used to create beauty. It was used to create an environment of great beauty. So people dressed in a simple but very comely way. And there was splendid architecture. Beautiful, comely houses, gardens and parks with lakes and streams and all sorts of beautiful trees and shrubs and peacocks and everything else you like that wander around. Deer, maybe. And a lot of effort went into the arts. There was transporting music. People would get together and be transported by fabulous music and heart-moving songs in beautifully decorated interiors. Great poetry read out, great philosophy. So that's the kingdom. And there was a prince and princess of this kingdom. And one day the king asked to see them. They were married and the king asked to see them. And he told them something very, very troubling. He said that their sister kingdom across the sea, which had been part of the same nation, had been taken over by an evil magician. And this magician had cast a spell. He cast a spell on the inhabitants. And one thing this spell did was it made them forget who they really were. It made them forget who they really were. And it made them want all sorts of silly, even ugly things. They were sort of all going around in a sort of dazed, forgetful state, trying to grab what they could get at others' expense, quarrelling and fighting about what they could get and engaging in all sorts of squalid, ugly things that they thought of as pleasure in their crazed state. And the king, the evil magician, had renamed the kingdom Samsara. And he asked the prince, he said, I'm going to ask you to do something really, really self-sacrificing and noble. I'm going to ask you to go to that city, and make it your mission to remind the inhabitants of who they really are. To help them break out of the spell. You're going to have to form together a community that have remembered who they are, that are no longer under the spell, and you're going to have to get that community to start a peaceful revolution so that you kick out the evil magician. That's your mission. Go. Yes. Okay. Off they go. So off they go. They travel to Samsara, the city, and they take all sorts of things. They've got to remind people of who they are. So they take artwork from their homeland, artwork and recordings of music and poetry, and books of philosophy. And so they go and they set up home. They find themselves a house and they set up home in Samsara, where everyone is under a spell. But as soon as they arrive, the spell starts to affect them. Their memory of their homeland becomes dim and fuzzy. It's just a sort of vague sense, a vague sort of glow. They can't remember it distinctly. It's just a vague glow. And a sense of longing for something. But okay, it's not long since they've been there, so they've still got a strong sense that this degraded city they're in is not their true home. They still realise that, and that they've got a task to perform. They're still remembering that, although their memory is very fuzzy. So they get themselves a house, they establish themselves in the city, and they start doing what they'd come to do. They invite people around, they talk to people, they meet people, they show them artwork from their homeland, and that sort of sets off something. People, it reminds people of something. They're not quite sure what, but they've got a sense of, that reminds me of something. A sense of longing for what these texts and poetry and books of philosophy, they sort of have something of the air of that other place. And people are reminded of who they really are and what their life is really about. So they do all of that, and that sense of Shraddha, longing for a higher realm, for beauty, nobility and wisdom, is awoken in some people. So over time, so some people's eyes are a bit lit up. It's all very vague, but there is that sense of familiarity and longing. And so over time they gather a community. They gather a community of people who try to live more as they would have lived before the evil magician took over, more as they live in the prince and princess's true homeland. But this takes decades. It takes decades to gather this community. And over these decades, the prince and the princess settle down. They start to, more and more, they forget where they've come from. More and more, they forget who they really are. More and more, they forget what their real mission was. They've established a little community of people who sort of are a bit more skillful. They've got a nice house. They're, managed to stay in reasonable mental states. So they sort of become, they use the philosophy of their homeland to become a bit more comfortable and cozy in samsara. And so do the people in their community. They're sort of a bit nicer than usual. So the people, the community that they've gathered, don't do the worst things that go on in samsara. They behave a bit better. But, the magician is not feeling threatened by this anymore. He might have felt threatened once, but he's not feeling threatened anymore. In fact, he's quite delighted because he thinks, well, all these people who maybe have a little bit more memory of who they really are, these discontents, well, this keeps them happy. It keeps them off the streets. They sort of think they're doing some good by just being a little bit more skillful than they would otherwise. The magician is certainly not threatened. There's not going to be a revolt. He's quite happy. And then another messenger arrives. Another messenger is sent by the king, and he turns up at their house, and maybe he shows them a piece of art, a holy symbol from their homeland, from their real home. And they get a vague memory, a vague sense of love and beauty, a vague sense of longing. And I think, well, there's something in this. And gradually this guy befriends them, and this memory becomes clearer and clearer and clearer. Gradually they get a clear sense of how they should be living. Gradually they remember the values that they love. Gradually they get a strong sense of longing for their real homeland. And eventually their spiritual friend who's come from the king helps them bring it all back. They remember it. They remember it all. They remember who they are. They remember their mission. They become increasingly discontented with the place they live, the samsara that they live in. But they long to go back to their homeland. But unfortunately, they've got into all sorts of rather coarsened habits while they've been living in samsara. They've become coarsened. Their mental states have become a bit muddy and grubby. They've lived in samsara for decades and they've got used to it. So they're not fit anymore to return to their true homeland. But they know what they have to do. They know what they have to do. They remember who they really are. They remember who they could be, the Buddha. They do what they need to make. They do what they need to do to make themselves more and more fit to return. The Dharma. And they form a community. They reinforce each other's sense of who they really are, what life is really about. The Sangha. They go from refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So, yeah, that's a little story. I sort of made that up out of this idea of the return journey. The return journey's got these themes of being a stranger in a strange land who forgets what they're about, forgets who they are, forget what their mission is, and gradually have to return to that. But what that story shows, I think, the moral of that story is that it's not enough to make ourselves cosy and comfortable in samsara. The Dharma is not just about, the Dharma is what the king sent us here to do. It's not just about becoming cosy and comfortable in samsara. We need to wake up out of the spell, and we need to remember our true selves and our true homeland, and we need to help others do the same, and then we need to organise a revolt, the Samsara Liberation Front, a mass breakout. We need to depose the evil magician. It's not enough to just be cosy and comfortable in samsara, which is why you can't practice Buddhism as a hobby. Thank you. No, actually, I've got more to say. I forgot, I've got more to say. Okay, so what does that tell us? What does that tell us about how we should practice? A couple of things, I think. I think one thing we should do is nurture our discontent. Notice and nurture our discontent. When that holiday doesn't quite turn out to be the thing that's going to make me happy forever, notice it. When that meal out, it doesn't really do it, notice it. When the new car or whatever doesn't quite do it, notice it. When in the middle of a sensory pleasure you think that's going to end, or notice it. Notice that it's always a bit unsatisfactory. All those things are always a bit unsatisfactory. Notice that. That's good. That's like the couple in samsara thinking, okay, this isn't really my homeland. Here we have no abiding city, it says in the Bible, I think. I quote that because Sangha quotes it, so I'm allowed to quote the Bible. Here we have no abiding city. So notice the discontent. This is not our true homeland. This society out there, samsara, is not our true homeland. And secondly, pay attention to Shraddha. Oops. So Shraddha, if you like, is that heart connection. That's something that when we come across the Dharma, we come across symbols of something higher, sort of says, I remember, there's a sort of intuitive sense of direction. Sangha actually describes it as the response, the resonance of what's ultimate in us to what's ultimate in the universe. In our story, Shraddha is awoken by the artwork or the poetry or the music that the couple bring from their true homeland. That reminds them of who they really are, what they should really be like. It awakens a sense of love and a sense of longing and a sense of desire to move towards that. So we need to notice our Shraddha, and we need to notice the things that awaken our Shraddha. It might be symbols, a symbol like the symbol of the Buddha, or all sorts of symbols, can have that air of another realm, that air of another country that reminds us who we really are and what we're aiming for. Could be Dharma texts, could be people, could be all sorts of things, could be meditations. But we need to notice our Shraddha. Shraddha is what's going to move us in the direction of return, if you like. So I think there are these two opposing things. Notice what's wrong. Notice discontent. And notice the love we have for something we may not be able to put our finger on. We may only have a vague recollection of, a bright blur that nonetheless we know we want to move towards, we have a sense of longing towards. So notice discontent and nurture it. Notice Shraddha, the intuitive sense of connection with something better, wanting to move towards something better, and nurture that for all we're worth. Thank you.